especially these. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Martin Center event on NATO's Nordic expansion, implications for the European Union. My name is Dr. Niklas Novaki. I'm a senior research officer at the Wilfried Martin Center, and I'll be the moderator of the discussion today. The Martin Center, as all of you know, is the political foundation and think tank of the European People's Party, the EPP. We conduct research on all of the different dimensions of European policy. We need a reminder to turn on the silence mode in your telephones, like there is in the movie theaters as well. So, as I was saying, we conduct research on all aspects of European policy that are relevant to policymakers both here in Brussels and in other European capitals. And of course, like one of our long-standing key priority areas is the area of European foreign security and defense policy, which is why we are all here today as well. When the Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989 and when communism collapsed in Europe afterwards, like Francis Fukuyama, American political scientist, argued that like these events constituted an end of history as we know it. But when you look at everything that has happened in Europe and around Europe, like over the past decade or so, I mean, you can't help but get a sense that we're not suffering from an end of history, but an abundance of history, and not necessarily in the most positive way. I mean, we've had the global financial crisis and the Eurozone debt crisis, the crisis in Ukraine since 2014, the Mediterranean migration crisis, the coronavirus pandemic, Brexit, and now, of course, the war in Ukraine, which began in February last year. And related to the war in Ukraine is, of course, the issue of Finland's and Sweden's application to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Both Finland and Sweden had for a long time followed a policy of military non-alignment. They were EU member states, but although they had been cooperating very actively with the United States and all were strong partners of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, there was a sense in both Helsinki and Stockholm that their national defense needs were satisfied quite well outside the North Atlantic Treaty Organization framework. But this, of course, changed very rapidly once the war began in February. There was a very sudden, very massive public opinion swing in both Finland and Sweden in favor of joining NATO, and this caused a very sudden, historically sudden change in the minds of political elites and decision makers. And then only a couple of months after the war began, the decision was taken in both Helsinki and Stockholm to apply for NATO membership. And of course, at the time, as we are here, almost every NATO country has already approved the accession protocols of Finland and Sweden, Hungary, and Turkey. And the eventual NATO membership of Finland and Sweden will, of course, not have implications just for the national defense policies of these two countries. It will also have implications for the European Union, of which they have been members since 1995. It also puts the European Union into a new and somewhat interesting position, because if we have a look at the history of European integration and how countries have joined the European Union and NATO, most countries have usually joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization before the European Union and not the other way around. And of course, joining NATO will affect the defense policies of both of these two countries, and by extension, it will also impact their policies towards the EU security and defense cooperation. But to make sense of these implications, to help us understand what the effects of Finland and Sweden joining NATO will be on their policies towards the EU security and defense cooperation, how they will impact the EU more broadly. We have two excellent speakers. Firstly, on my far right, we have Mr. Tuomas Isomarkku, Senior Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute for International Affairs, and joining from Helsinki. And then we also have Mr. Kalle Håkansson, who is an Associate Fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Fellow and a PhD candidate at Malmö University. welcome to both of you gentlemen. And just to remind everybody, like of the house rules, we have about 1 hour 15 minutes reserved for today's discussion. Both speakers will initially give opening remarks of about 10 minutes, after which we'll have an open discussion here amongst within the panel, and then a Q&A session with you, the audience. So this event is also live streamed. It'll be on the record. So like, please feel free to engage on social media if you wish. But without any further ado, I will pass the floor to Tuomas Isomarkku to give the perspective from Helsinki. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Niklas. Thank you for the kind invitation. So in my opening remarks, I was asked to try and shed light on 3 topics. First, how will Finland's NATO accession affect Finnish security and defense policy? Secondly, how will Finland's NATO accession shape Finland's views on the EU's security and defense dimension? And thirdly, what does all this mean for the EU as a whole? In the following, I will actually, in many parts, rely very heavily on an analysis that my colleague Matti Pesu and I published last December, which is sort of the first comprehensive attempt to identify the basic contours of Finnish NATO policy. Now, Finland is, of course, not yet a member, but there are already many things that we can say about how Finnish NATO policy will look like once it joins the alliance. And like I said, I will draw very heavily on the analysis that we wrote, and you can also all take a look at it. It is freely available on the website of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Now, to the first question, how will Finland's NATO accession affect Finnish security and defense policy? I think there are 2 very different ways to look at this question, but they may actually both hold equally true. First, it's of course clear that NATO accession is a true sea change in Finnish security and defense policy. I've heard several people in the Finnish Defense Administration say that it is actually the biggest adjustment to the Finnish defense system since the end of the Second World War. For decades, Finland and Finnish defense has been very strongly nationally oriented and also guided by this strong culture of self-reliance. And seen from this perspective, placing Finland's defense into NATO's collective defense will of course require a dramatic cultural change, a totally different mindset, if you will. For example, as part of NATO's defense planning process, Finland will now, for the first time, need to justify its defense choices to other allies. And this adds a completely new element of international accountability to the development of Finnish defense. Overall, I would say that Finland will have to learn to trust its allies, and it will also need to internalize the kind of reciprocity that is at the heart of an alliance like NATO. Now, the first perspective highlights the dramatic shift that this NATO accession is going to be for Finland. The second perspective, which like I said, find equally valid, actually highlights the elements of continuity here. So the second perspective would be that Finland has actually never been as close to NATO and as close to being allied as it was when it applied for membership in May 2022. Ever since the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, Finland has actually gradually integrated itself into the NATO-led Western deterrence and defense system, although it has done this so far without formally joining the alliance. Finland has forged ever closer ties to NATO itself. It joined NATO's enhanced opportunities partnership and has also been regularly invited to the table together with Sweden when the security of the Baltic Sea region has been discussed within the alliance. And then perhaps even more importantly, Finland has actively enhanced different kinds of defense partnerships with different states and groups of states. The closest and most important of those partners has of course been Sweden, but Finland has also notably deepened its ties with several NATO members, above all the US, the UK and Norway, but also France and Germany. And quite importantly, the explicit aim of these partnerships, at least from the Finnish point of view, has been to increase the likelihood that in the event of a military conflict with Russia, Finland would get the help and support it needs. So indeed, in our paper on Finland's NATO policy, we actually call the period between 2014 and 2022 the alignment period, as it was during these years that Finland definitely abandoned the principle of non-alliance. And seen in this light, actually, Finland's NATO accession will not present such a dramatic shift, but rather the logical continuation of a longer-term trend. Now, secondly, I would like to briefly talk about the potential implications of Finland's NATO accession for the Finnish views on the EU's security and defense dimension. You may know that Finland has always been an active proponent of and participant in the EU's security and defense policy, particularly during the last about 10 years, and especially again since the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, Finland has strongly supported all efforts to broaden and deepen security and defense-related cooperation in the EU. Finland has thus warmly welcomed the introduction of the coordinated annual review on defense, the European Defence Fund, and permanent structured cooperation. A very unique feature of Finland's EU engagement has also been the country's strong emphasis on the significance of the EU's mutual assistance clause, Article 42.7, which has thus far been the only formal mutual assistance obligation Finland has been bound to. Finland has even cautiously embraced the contested concept of strategic autonomy. However, Finland has also highlighted that strategic autonomy should be understood as increased European capacity to act, benefiting both the EU and NATO, and should also by no means signify a weakening of the transatlantic link. Although one could say that Finland's view of the EU's security and defense dimension has been highly positive, I would also argue that Finland's policy has been driven by a considerable degree of realism and pragmatism. So Finland has consistently emphasized the importance of a strong and capable NATO and the continued US commitment to European security. Moreover, Finland has insisted that the EU's security and defense efforts are and always should be complementary to and supportive of what NATO does. Actually, one could argue, as we do in our paper, that somewhat paradoxically, the relative importance of the EU in Finland's security and defense policy has probably actually decreased in the latter part of the 2010s, as the cooperation with Sweden, the US, Norway, NATO, and the Joint Expeditionary Force gaining in importance. This has been particularly evident in Finland's very limited participation in PESCO projects, for example. So Finland ranks among the countries that participate in the smallest number of PESCO projects. How will NATO membership change this? Well, I would say that as a NATO member state, it is clear that the alliance will be the focal point of Finland's security and defense policy. And that also means that NATO policy will absorb significant political, administrative, and military resources. Above all, Article 42.7 may no longer be as important for Finland as it has been thus far. However, we argue in our paper, and I think that reflects also the view in Helsinki, that Finland should still play an active role in the EU's security and defense policy, and it should also not entirely play down the mutual assistance clause. We all know that Article 42.7 and Article 5, they cover somewhat different geographical areas. The EU and NATO have rather different instruments at their disposal. So Article 42.7 and Article 5 may also be utilized in rather different scenarios. So instead of just focusing on Article 5 and completely playing down Article 42.7 would make no sense. It would be better to focus on how the different mutual commitments can form a more coherent and mutually complementary framework. Like I said, overall there is a sense in Helsinki that Finland should still continue to play an active and supportive role in developing the EU security and defense policy. But this should, of course, happen in full respect for NATO's role as Europe's primary collective defense organization. I think Finland's the kind of pragmatic and realistic view Finland has had of European defense will still continue to be a rather good basis for this kind of a policy, even when Finland joins NATO. And then finally, there is a sense in Helsinki that Finland's entry into NATO will actually strengthen its credibility in matters concerning EU-NATO relations, which will be of even greater importance than today. Then finally, just very few words about what all this means for the EU. I think that's really what we are going to discuss in the following as well. But just intuitively, I would say that Finland's and Sweden's NATO accession will strengthen the kind of an implicit division of labor that has been there between the EU and NATO already for a long time. And that has, in my view, actually only strengthened or become more pronounced since 2014. And by this division of labor, I mean NATO's role as Europe's primary security provider and the organization responsible for collective territorial defense, and the EU's role, on the other hand, as an actor that uses its distinct set of instruments and tools to both complement and support NATO, and having a heavy focus on foreign policy instruments, non-military threats, as well as enhancing practical defense cooperation between European states.
Thank you. That's a lot of food for thought already. I started to think when you outlined what sort of role Finland might play as a NATO member state, and like how it might affect, how the membership might affect Finland's EU policy of like what sort of what sort of role Finland might adopt, and whether that role would resemble more of that of, let's say, of the Baltic countries, like the role that the Baltic countries have adopted, emphasizing very strongly the primacy and priority of NATO, and underlining in most discussions relating to EU defense that NATO should remain the main game in town, or whether it will be something more akin to that role that Germany has traditionally, like, for example, played, because Germany is another interesting example in the sense that while Berlin has always stressed the importance and primacy of NATO as the main framework for European collective security cooperation, Berlin has at the same time also kind of stressed that the European Union can still play an important role, and its security and defense dimension shouldn't be underestimated in that sense. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on this.
Well, on the basis of what I've so far heard in Helsinki and what I what we also write in our analysis, I would say that the Finnish role is probably more likely going to resemble that of Germany and the Netherlands than that of the Baltic countries. But at the same time, I mean, it's clear, but I guess it's clear also for Germany that NATO will be the focal point, and simply now the pre-accession phase, but also then when the accession materializes, NATO will just, like I said, it will absorb a lot of political and military resources, and that will of course have an impact on how much Finland will invest on the EU side, at least in the short term.
Yeah, of course, and as you already mentioned as well, the like despite the very strong emphasis that Finland has placed on the development of EU security and defense cooperation over the past years, the interest on the other hand towards things like PESCO projects has been perhaps lower than one might intuitively expect. So, but we'll continue with Mr. Kalle Håkansson, and Kalle will now give the view from Stockholm. So, I mean, what do you think? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Niklas, and thank you, Martin Center, for setting up this timely event. So in my opening remarks, I will try to give a little bit historical perspective on Sweden and NATO and EU. I will try to discuss how Swedish and Finnish NATO membership what it can mean for the EU-NATO cooperation, and finally, what the NATO membership, or hopefully NATO membership, will mean for Sweden's approach to EU security and defense policy. So looking at the Swedish NATO process, this is a process that is, in one way, a huge shift in Swedish policy, but in another way, it's a very logical step in that sense, and very close to what Thomas just said. So Sweden has been neutral or military non-aligned for 200 years before the decision to seek membership in NATO. And actually, the decision to not seek membership in NATO in the 50s and the start of the alliance was very much connected to the position of Finland, which at then was forced into the friendship agreement with the Soviet Union. However, I would say that this kind of position of neutrality, or later on as military non-aligned, became part of kind of the Swedish DNA or a Swedish identity, and Sweden has very active foreign policy during the Cold War, but also afterwards, in that sense. And I would say Finland, in my mind, had a more pragmatic view on its military non-alignment, and early on, after the fall of the Soviet Union, kind of declared its NATO option, saying that if the security situation would get worse in the Finnish neighborhood, it could seek membership in NATO. However, the first step of kind of abolishing the Swedish neutrality and later on military non-alignment was the decision to seek EU membership in the 90s, just as Niklas mentioned. However, I would say that Sweden did not see the kind of decision to seek EU membership as a kind of foreign and security policy decision. In that time, it was a mere economic decision. Sweden has had a very British outlook on EU membership, viewing it as a market, seeing it as a very economic project in that sense. However, still it was an important step in kind of abolishing neutrality, and over time Sweden has deepened its relationship with and cooperation with NATO, and also had very strong bilateral defense cooperation with Finland. And then last year, of course, the big shock with the war led to kind of the decision to apply for a NATO membership in Sweden. I would say that this identity or DNA of Sweden, however, made the kind of the political process more kind of painful in Sweden than in Finland in that sense. However, kind of the signals that came from Helsinki, the already close cooperation with NATO, as well as the pressing security situation, led to the decision to seek for membership in NATO together with Finland. So I would say that kind of with the decision to to seek and hopefully soon become a full member of NATO, this can be seen as kind of a final step for Sweden to become kind of a normal European country, organizing its political and military cooperation through both the EU and NATO in that sense. And if we look to what will kind of Sweden and Finland's NATO membership mean for the cooperation with NATO, between EU and NATO in that sense, I think that going to 23 out of 27 EU countries being members of NATO, it would be even easier to cooperate and kind of push forward the cooperation even more between the organizations. However, if we look back, I would say that Sweden and Finland traditionally has had a very positive outlook on strengthening EU and NATO cooperation. And this is due to that they have been part of the Partnership for Peace since the 90s. They have participated in missions under NATO flag. They have been enhanced opportunity partners to the alliance in that sense. And this has made the countries very interoperable with NATO and very aligned with NATO standards and procedures in that sense. And I think if we look ahead, I would argue that the roles for EU and NATO has become even clearer now. NATO will continue, just as the EU has underlined in conclusions and declarations, that to be kind of the backbone of collective defense in Europe, no, in the kind of transatlantic community. And we saw it with the decisions taken in Madrid last year, with the new strategic concept in NATO. However, I would argue that the EU has a very important role as a kind of enabler for collective defense in NATO. Here I'm thinking about capacities created through defense industrial corporations, such as the European Defence Fund, such as the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, or initiatives such as military mobility, which could actually strengthening deterrent and defense within NATO. Or now in turn of, for instance, procuring material and having common European solutions on this. And we have seen how kind of the war in Ukraine has really kind of taught us that we need to have a strong industrial base to kind of supply the weapons and the munitions that is needed for the war fighting. And then in terms to, for instance, cyber threats or hybrid threats or disinformation and geo-economic coercion, there the EU has the main tools. It should kind of take the lead, but also cooperate closely with NATO in that regard. And I think that we see this underlined in the new third EU-NATO declaration. And I hope that Sweden and Finland, as members of NATO, but also members of EU, can be kind of bridge builders between the alliance and the two organizations. And finally, I want to kind of give a perspective on how I think Sweden will look upon EU's security and defense policy after becoming a member of NATO. And in that regard, I want to kind of outline three different perspectives. One that I fear, one that I hope, and one that I think will probably happen. So starting off what I fear will happen. And I fear that Sweden will focus its main attention on NATO and kind of forget and kind of neglect the important kind of new initiatives and developments that we are seeing at the EU level at this moment. In its kind of eager of being a very proactive NATO member, it's kind of starts to kind of neglect the EU side in that sense. And we see that, just as I mentioned before, the kind of EU's added value in its financial firepower, supporting defense industrial cooperation through the EDF. Here, Sweden has a large defense industry that could really kind of gain from being an active partner in, for instance, the European Defence Fund or PESCO. Or the new initiatives on joint procurement is another kind of clear example of this added value of the EU, I would say. And I hope that there are a real kind of political willingness to kind of strongly support new initiatives such as the DIRPA and the follow-up EDIP proposal. And we all see this in terms of, for instance, the EU's financial firepower in kind of the EU-economic rivalries in world politics today. And I think that this will only continue to kind of increase with kind of the Sino-American rivalry in world politics. And as I said, on cyber, hybrid threats, threats under Article 5, there the EU really has a role to play. So my fear is that Sweden will kind of give less attention to these kind of developments within the EU when Sweden will become a NATO member. If we instead go to the perspective, what I hope for is that I hope that Sweden will continue to be a very active member state within the EU that kind of continues to tries to kind of push forward work on EU security and defense policy initiatives, while at the same time be a very proactive NATO member. And if we look back historically, Sweden has been both an active member within the EU's security and defense policy. It has, for instance, participated in every civilian and military CSDP mission that the EU has launched. However, it has also been a bit kind of lukewarm or hesitant in terms of, for instance, more institutional developments within the union. So both in terms in defense industrial cooperation, it has been more lukewarm on Article 42.7 compared to Helsinki, I would say. However, if we look now, I would say that one positive aspect is the ongoing Swedish EU presidency. And I think that the presidency has kind of made the Swedish government to become a bit more positive on, for instance, defense industrial cooperation within the EU. And I can just mention here that the Swedish defense industry is, of course, a bit special in Europe. It has a lot of foreign ownership, a lot of ties to the UK and the US, and it has, in that regard, been a bit hesitant or skeptical on, for instance, the European Defence Fund or PESCO in the past due to these kind of connections to foreign ownership. However, I think that we maybe are seeing that Sweden are starting to become a bit more proactive and positive on this. And I really hope that Sweden also will underline and kind of see the complementarity between EU and NATO. And I think that it was quite telling that when Sweden and the Swedish government had a conference on security and defense policy in Stockholm or in Uppsala just a couple of weeks ago, they put the kind of partnership basket from the strategic compass and the EU-NATO cooperation in focus in that regard. And I think this is telling on what Sweden will try to do, kind of pushing forward cooperation between EU and NATO. And then if we turn to kind of the perspective of what I think will happen, I think that we will probably be somewhere in the middle between my fears and my hopes in that sense. I think that Sweden will continue to be active and try to kind of focus on the developments within EU security and defense policy. It will, however, still be a bit lukewarm on institutional developments. It will focus a lot of attention on NATO in the coming years. However, we are in a time where kind of taboos are broken, and I think and hope that Sweden still will continue to support, for instance, new EU initiatives on joint procurement. And this is something that I think really is needed. And here I think that if we can get kind of the financial firepower of the EU together with the kind of willingness of the member state, then we can see this clear added value, and this will also benefit NATO in the end. But with that, I will conclude.
Thank you. And I guess kind of what both of you emphasize is that there would ideally emerge this complementarity that between the two organizations. NATO, of course, like taking the lead of the conventional territorial defense of Finland and Sweden, and then the EU kind of continuing to play a role and adding value in the usual fields in which it has roles and in which it has engaged in the past, and I think especially the defense industrial cooperation, things like military mobility, capability development, like come into mind. But but this of course kind of depends on, I mean, how EU defense cooperation like continues to develop and like what sort of form it will take, like continue going forward. And it is interesting to think, I mean, how that cooperation has changed, like in overall in the past couple of decades. Because if you think, I mean, last week was the one-year anniversary of the Ukraine war, but like this year is also another interesting anniversary. This year will be the 20th anniversary, like since the EU launched like the first missions and operations in the context of its common security and defense policy back in 2003. And this was a time in which what EU security and defense cooperation was really about was out-of-area crisis management. A very different type of issue than what the EU is doing today, although the EU continues to conduct and launch crisis management operations. But the raison d'etre, so to say, is not the crisis management side of things anymore as much as it is this capability development, capacity building, etc. And the Ukraine war, in a way, has kind of added even a new dimension, which is this very muscular ability to provide support to a country fighting a conventional war against a great power rival. And in this context, the decision to activate and provide assistance to the European Peace Facility very quickly since the war began, I think, is absolutely transformative. And I was just wondering, like, your thoughts of like how Finland and Sweden will kind of like if their attitudes towards EU defense cooperation will continue to evolve along the lines that EU defense cooperation itself has continued to evolve, and like how they will approach EU defense cooperation as NATO allies if the Union continues to develop this ever more muscular approach to defense as it has. So,
Yeah, I can
yeah,
start,
please.
I can just start with my 1 cent on, for instance, crisis management, since I think that we have seen in the past couple of years a kind of a fatigue of crisis management of the Union, and even more now with kind of war on the continent of Europe. However, I think that going forward, I think that the EU needs to kind of step up within crisis management again, and this is kind of due to 2 factors or 3 factors maybe. That the US will be much more focused on the Indo-Pacific region going forward. They will want the EU and the Europeans to kind of step up in terms of the neighborhood around Europe. Also, NATO will be focused on collective defense. They've gone back to their core task. We have seen in the past kind of the rivalry of kind of crisis management missions, both by NATO and the EU in that sense. So I think that even though the political appetite right now is limited maybe for crisis management missions, I think that we need to kind of start discussing this. And looking at Sweden, I think that traditionally Sweden has been very active, for instance, in EU crisis management, but also in UN peacekeeping and so on. And I think that this will continue in one sense. However, of course, the situation with the kind of security situation in Europe will, of course, affect. And in that sense, I think that the political willingness is more limited today. However, I think that we still need to start think about these issues even more within our capitals, but also here in Brussels. Then, in terms of kind of the capacities that you mentioned that are being created on the defense industrial side, I think that I want to give credit for the institutions. I think that the EU institutions, the European External Action Service, the European Commission, and the European Defence Agency, and so on, they've been very active. They're pushing this. I think that now it's kind of up to the member states to kind of take a decision or take a leap in one sense. There are a lot of ideas out there, and I think that the member states need to kind of show political willingness now to kind of take this a step forward.
Thomas.
Well, when it comes to Finland and how Finland's policy within NATO will look like, it is of course clear that Finland's focus will be very much on deterrence and defense. That's the main reason Finland is joining NATO, and that will be the main task that it expects NATO to contribute to. But at the same time, like I said, Finland does need to do a bit of learning, and one important aspect is that there is need for this kind of reciprocity within the alliance and among the allies, and there are of course those states within the alliance whose concerns are not necessarily that much about Russia and do revolve more about around the conflicts in the neighborhood and crisis management will be important in addressing the concerns of those states and making sure that the alliance offers something for everyone. And when it comes to crisis management, I would actually expect Finland to be pretty pragmatic about the framework in which it is done, whether NATO or the EU. I think both are fully acceptable for Finland, and I would expect Finland to be supportive of increasing the EU's capacity to act in crisis management also in the future.
At this stage, I would already encourage the audience to start thinking about questions. Like, I will open the floor like very soon for questions. But in the meantime, I would just want both of you to reflect a little bit on how it was possible, and like how would you explain the very sudden change in the public opinion in both Finland and Sweden that we saw towards NATO membership, like once the war began, because they had, of course, been kind of crises, conflicts involving Russia in the past, like the 2008 Russia-Georgian war, the 2014 Ukraine crisis and the annexation of Crimea, that didn't cause the same type of swinging public opinion in favor of NATO membership as the beginning of the war last year did. And given how quickly everything happened, I mean, how was this all possible? And perhaps we'd start with Tuomas this time.
Well, it's true that Crimea did not cause any sizable impact on the Finnish public opinion. But at the same time, perhaps to some extent, Crimea was still a bit muddier as a conflict, more difficult to grasp. Whereas in the case of this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we already, as Finns, we have the analogy of the Winter War, which I think is in the back of our minds, and I think that has been a very important factor in driving the public opinion. Yeah, that's pretty much what how I would explain why it happened so
different type of
suddenly.
conflict, more kind of easier to understand for
them. Yeah, full scale, very traditional type of warfare, if you like, and then the fact that we already have this historical analogy that is so easily applicable to what's going on in Ukraine. I think those would be like my explanations.
Kalle.
I would say if we look back to when the war happened, of course this was a big shock and a big crisis for Europe. But a lot of like the political parties in the Swedish Parliament still was skeptical about NATO membership in that period. We saw that statements that it could destabilize the situation around Sweden. However, I think that kind of the process when the Swedish political establishment understand that the Finnish process had started, even though they hadn't taken the decision, this kind of impulse from the Finnish side kind of started kind of the discussion within the political establishment in Sweden. And when kind of the political establishment started to kind of more publicly discuss NATO, then we saw kind of the public opinion started to kind of change as well. So this was more of like a situation where actually the political establishment kind of pushed the public opinion a bit on NATO. And I would say maybe in Finland it was maybe a little bit more the opposite, that the public opinion started to kind of push the political level in one sense.
Yeah, I would also say that in the Finnish case, it was really the rapid shift in public opinion that initiated the whole process. But then many policymakers have highlighted that they they had actually been thinking about this for a longer time already. I don't know. Some may not be that genuine in their remarks. That's just something they say afterwards. But then, of course, I think some have truly already thought about the implications ever since Russia started to put forward demands that would have clearly limited Finland's and also Sweden's room of maneuver in their security and defense policies.
Yeah, I completely agree that the kind of the political discussion in Finland started earlier in Sweden as well. So I think that also affected how Finland kind of pushed Sweden in that sense. It's quite ironic that Sweden in one way pushed Finland into EU and Finland pushed Sweden into NATO. So
it was a reverse situation this time.
Absolutely, and I mean, for years there were always concerns about Sweden moving first when it comes to NATO, and what would Finland do in that kind of a situation? And then it came the other way around. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of irony there.
Let's start taking some questions. Are there anybody with a burning question? Yes, you, sir, there.
It's not burning, but I'll ask it anyway. I wondered if there is any practical enhancement of the EU defense policy that, in your opinion, would lead Sweden and Finland not to neglect, as you said, not to neglect the EU defense cooperation, or if, on the contrary, the two countries will always prefer the NATO umbrella for their defense policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and there.
I've missed the word Arctic, and well, having now two Arctic countries to a certain extent, I'm wondering, the EU has only in 2021 released a more strategic outlook on the Arctic. Before it was environmental issues, climate change issues, trade issues, but then geopolitics came into. So what will this mean? A further push, different perspective? Thank you.
Thank you. And then there's one question that we got from an online viewer, which is, Finland was an important part of NATO KFOR in Kosovo over the past decades. Given the above, how will joining NATO improve Finland's position from a tactical/field angle? And what are your expectations? And I think this is to Tuomas. So we have three questions. One is, what practical announcement at the EU level regarding your defense cooperation kind of could help avoid a situation in which, like Helsinki and Stockholm, would perhaps inadvertently like neglect EU defense cooperation as NATO members? The second about like the Arctic dimension, and then third, you Tuomas, about the tactical field angle. Please, let's start with Kalle.
Yeah, I think it's in terms of the first question about if we don't end up in a situation where Sweden kind of neglects or other countries neglect the EU defense push, I think it's in the end it comes up to money, to the different new initiatives. For instance, the new initiative on joint procurement, the DIRPA, it has a very limited budget. However, it will follow another initiative by the summer. Let's see if kind of the money is there. If the money is there, the member states kind of goes for it, even though it's their own money in the end. But it's still a great incentive, and this is the kind of financial firepower that I think that the EU should do, and have kind of the an added value asset. So I think that it comes down to money in the end, very much. And in terms of the Arctic region, I think that this will be a region where we will see a lot more like discussions about. We'll see a lot more interest and a lot more military perspective on how kind of the region develops in terms of sea lanes, in terms of China, Russia, and so on and so forth. And I think that here Sweden and Finland, coming as Arctic countries to NATO, will, of course, try to push this dimension in NATO. I'm not sure if they will push it in the EU. I think that they've done this a bit in the past, but the Arctic region traditionally is seen as this kind of low tension area. They've not want to kind of militarize it. I think that this situation is going towards more militarization in that sense, and I think that they will probably turn to NATO more in that sense and trying to kind of discuss Arctic policy within the NATO framework. So I'm not sure how they will kind of handle the EU in these issues.
Tuomas.
Yeah, what kind of practical measures would it take for Finland to still remain active in terms of the EU security and defense? Well, I mean, in the Finnish case, I would say that there is already this kind of underlying willingness to advance things also on the EU side. But beyond that, it's also simply the practical value that the EU measures produce in terms of the kind of issues that Finland now considers most pressing. So in this sense, I would say that military mobility, for example, is rather interesting and important for Finland. If you just take a look at Finland's position on the map, then Finland would, in the event of a military conflict, Finland would be a country that would need to be reinforced militarily, and for that to happen, that would require rather sizable arrangements, as Finland's geographical location is just so difficult. It is separated from most of its neighbors by the Baltic Sea. It's also physically very far from the western centers of military power, so to speak. So military mobility would be one of those things. When it comes to defense industrial issues and procurement, I'm not so sure that those will be such big priorities. I mean, Finland doesn't really have any European dimension to its procurement policy. For example, Finland tends to procure US defense material, and I don't really see that changing now. As for the Arctic, I think my thoughts are very similar to Kalle's. So I think the awareness of the Arctic as a potential scenario of geopolitical tensions and geopolitical conflict has definitely increased in Finland. And the Arctic will be one of those geographical factors that will drive Finnish NATO policy also. So already now there is much more focus in Finland on the Arctic. Finland is of course not an Arctic coastal state, but still, as due to its geographic location so close to the Kola Peninsula, for example, it definitely has a very important place in the geopolitical constellations of the Arctic. And here cooperation with both with Sweden and with Norway will be of crucial importance. I'm afraid I'm not qualified to answer the KFOR question, but let me just point out that Finland recently decided to increase its contribution to the KFOR mission, which was definitely meant also as a sign to show that Finland is still willing to invest in crisis management, also even though its focus is very much on deterrence and defense.
Let's take another round of questions. Yes, there in the back, you sir.
So I hope you can hear me. Yeah. In terms of the complementarity between the EU and NATO, I think both of you mentioned it. What are your views on the potential implications of this Nordic expansion on the countries that are in the EU but not in NATO, like Austria, for example? Thank you.
Yes, there in the back, like two gentlemen, like the gentleman with the microphone already. So.
Yes, thank you. Would like to inquire what is exactly now the Swedish and Finnish vision of the end game on the east, because you are joining NATO because of Russia. So we see that it's not only the war in Ukraine, there are also plans for the Anschluss of Belarus, and it will change, well, a bit security situation on the east. So what you, and I will use your words, what you hope, what you fear, and what you expect to happen on the east.
Okay, then Miguel.
Miguel Diaz, retired. My question has to do with burden sharing. As you know, Sweden and Finland's candidacy comes in the midst of this long-standing internal debate within NATO as to how much of a burden all the members should share with the US, pushing the 2% of GDP threshold as a minimum. Where do you think Sweden and Finland will add to the conversation? Will they be able to move the needle forward or backwards? What would be the change of dynamics in that debate with Sweden and Finland joining NATO?
Excellent question. So we have three questions. First, the implications of the forthcoming NATO membership of Finland and Sweden for the remaining non-NATO EU countries. Then, secondly, what do Finland and Sweden hope, fear, and expect with regard to how things will develop in the east of Europe? And then finally, how will Finland and Sweden? Sorry, like I got a brain freeze now. Miguel, could you remind me? Like I got a brain freeze at the moment regarding your question. So.
How will it impact the debate within NATO on burden sharing?
Exactly. Thank you. So let's start with Tuomas this time.
Implications of NATO enlargement for those EU member states that are going to remain outside NATO. Well, one of the things that Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin has said in the context of this whole NATO debate is that she already before the war in Ukraine began, she felt sometimes frustrated at the EU tables when security and defense issues were discussed, because she felt she was outside the conversation in the sense that many of those issues had already been discussed within NATO, where Finland was not present. So I guess that tells you something about how the position of these states is going to be like. At the same time, for most of them, it's a choice they have made for themselves and are comfortable with. So I don't expect there to be any pressure for them to move, but of course they will be even more outside in a sense than they have been so far. The end game in the East, I think that's a very difficult question for me to answer. But of course, like Finland's focus will be on the whole Eastern Front, basically. As an EU member state, as a NATO member, Finland will be interested in everything that Russia does and everything that NATO can do to deter Russia. With regard to burden sharing, well, Finland's defense spending now stands at about 2%, and that is mainly because of the major procurement processes that have been going on and that are still going on. And I think it will be interesting to see how things develop. I think, as far as I can remember, if things continue the way they are planned to, Finland would actually fall below the 2% threshold in 2026. That's at least what the government has stated, and money will be an issue. At the same time, I think there is awareness of in Finland of how important burden sharing is within NATO, and how much your defense spending affects your status as a NATO member state, especially in the eyes of the US administration. So in that sense, I think Finns are definitely aware of this, and it can well be that decisions are made so that Finland will comply with that 2% goal also in the future. But I'm not so sure about Finland trying to move the needle forward.
3 or 4%.
Yeah, I don't really see that coming.
In terms of the other neutral countries, in that sense, in the EU, I think that both me and Thomas was part of an ESFR report last year about like the neutrals within the EU, and that kind of report assessed that Sweden and Finland was kind of neutral in name only. So I think that from the start, Sweden and Finland has been a bit special within this group of neutral countries or military non-aligned countries within the EU. So I think that the EU has also been quite flexible and pragmatic these last couple of years, putting up for instance, the peace facility outside the budget, where these countries kind of participate with non-military equipment, for instance. So I think that maybe this is not the ideal option, but I think that it's good to be pragmatic, and what works in that sense. In terms of the eastern area, Belarus, Russia, I have a quite bleak outlook. I fear that we are kind of in this new kind of security situation, or I would say that we are in this new security situation where we, instead of kind of security with, we have security from Russia and Belarus in that sense. So I have a quite bleak outlook on especially those two countries in that sense. In terms of burden sharing, Sweden will go up to 2% by 2026, I think now. So this has also been a kind of a push from the war in Ukraine. I also think that 2% will probably be the floor within NATO for most countries. I think that just like Finland, Sweden will want to at least put 2% in that sense and show that they are willing to kind of, take burden sharing seriously. The Prime Minister has said that they want to be a security provider for the alliance in that sense, and I think it is important in that sense to kind of put up the money. And if we look like historically, Sweden has been on 3 and 4% of GDP on defense during the Cold War and during its neutrality. So it's of course a difficult political decision to put more money on defense, especially in inflation times and so on. But I think that at least 2% will be the target that Sweden need to kind of put up.
Any remaining questions in the audience for anybody? Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentations. Appreciate very much. Just a question about your applications for NATO. Just started and it's blocked by Turkey. I would like to have a comment on this, and how is the perception of the citizens and political parties in your countries on this issue?
Thank you. And then next to you.
Hi, my name is Lucas Haugeberg, and I'm Norwegian. And I guess from the Norwegian perspective, one of the things that often comes up is that
what took you so long?
Yeah, is that like our most important port essentially is Gothenburg, which kind of illustrates the sense that kind of the accession to NATO of Sweden and Finland would open up a completely new frontier in terms of cooperation within the Nordic region. So I'm just asking whether or not you have some thoughts on that, and how perhaps you could elaborate on not only kind of the way in which the US and the region would, and the cooperation with the US would enhance security, but also within the Nordic region itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Kalle, let's start with you.
Yeah, I start with the last question then on the Nordic cooperation. And I think that we have seen since 2014 and since Crimea in that sense, that Nordic cooperation has gained in importance for Sweden and Finland, but also for Norway, for Denmark. It has started to kind of become interested in Nordic defense cooperation. And this, of course, due to kind of the security situation. And now, when all Nordic countries, for the first time in 200 years, in kind of are in the same kind of security alliance in that sense, I think that there are great opportunities to strengthening Nordic cooperation. I think that we are already seeing, for instance, how Sweden, Norway, and Finland can kind of cooperate in the kind of high north in that sense, and we are seeing cooperation between Sweden and Denmark and Finland on more sea, on the Baltic Sea and so on. So I think that we will get a lot of more Nordic cooperation. Let's see about, there are discussion about headquarters and for the Nordic region and so on, and I think it will be important to kind of see the Nordic region as a whole for the first time, and really kind of have defense planning for the whole region in that sense. And then in terms of the Turkey question, this is of course the $1 million or €1 million question. I think that at the moment, I think in Sweden that people are maybe starting to realize that maybe the Finnish NATO bid will become kind of ratified before the Swedish bid, and I think that it has started a kind of discussion about, in the short term, this is not like a big problem. Of course, both Sweden and Finland have underlined that they want to join together, but if this is a short period of time, this would not be a huge problem for Sweden, in that sense that it's not a front state country towards Russia in that sense as well. However, if this kind of drags along, and then the kind of defense planning for NATO will become very difficult, in both in terms of Finland, but also the Baltic states. And it will also be a very big problem for NATO's open door policy. So if this is a limited time period, maybe not a big, huge problem. If this drags along, quite big problem.
Tuomas.
Yeah, in terms of cooperation within the Nordic group of countries, from the Finnish perspective, especially two things are quite important here, I would say. Security of supply, Sweden and Norway both being very important in that sense, and then the Arctic, which was already mentioned. So those are definitely important things. When it comes to cooperation among the 5 Nordic states, I actually don't expect any like major push forward, maybe, or that would mostly be perhaps on the political side of things, whereas militarily, I think cooperation between Finland, Sweden, and Norway will be more important than cooperation at 5. That maybe also goes for Sweden, Denmark, and Norway among themselves. I'm not that sure about that, but I would say especially Finland, Sweden, and Norway, they have very strong common interests. In terms of the application process, well, there's definitely widespread frustration about how things are at the moment. Now, there have been some signals that the Finnish NATO bid might move forward before the Swedish one. And I think Finnish policymakers are still really hesitant to talk about this. There's also a lot of hesitancy to like actively push this forward, or there's still a lot of internal debate about whether Finland should adopt now that view that we'll go first and then help Sweden from within to get inside as soon as possible. But I guess the fact that Stockholm now also starts to see that Finland may go first, it also helps in Finland to accept that this might be the way things go. But like Kalle already said, if there's a short time lag between the Swedish and the Finnish ratification, that's not a big problem. But if this becomes a longer-term issue, that's definitely bad for the credibility of NATO's open door policy, but also bad for the kind of very practical things that we would need to do in the coming months and years.
Thank you, Kalle. Do you want to react like very quickly, just because I was thinking, how would Stockholm kind of react, and what it would mean for Stockholm indeed, like if we would eventually, or if the scenario that Tuomas outlined, I mean, would indeed happen, that Finland would join first, and then Sweden would have to wait a little bit. I mean, what would that mean for Stockholm?
I think that, as I said, I think that the kind of political establishment has started to realize that this is a possibility, and I also think that there are extremely close contacts between Stockholm and Helsinki. And I think that really helps to kind of understand each other and to kind of, even though they want to go hand in hand as they've underlined from time to time, I think that there are this kind of realization that this is maybe okay. There are a strong political understanding and also contact between the two capitals. So I think that in a sense kind of puts the pressure on Stockholm a little bit less.
Thank you so much to both of you gentlemen, and I think it's been a very, very fruitful and interesting discussion, and I've taken a lot of notes. I'm just trying to think of a couple of things to summarize, like before I let all of you go and go about with your day. And two things kind of come into my mind, I mean, based on like what's been said. I mean, the first one is that NATO membership will, of course, absolutely like transform the national defense policies of both Finland and Sweden. For both countries, NATO will become the primary framework for defense cooperation. And even though they have other relationships, other dependencies, I mean, there will be a reprioritization of these relationships, simply because NATO will be the most credible one in their network of relationships and dependencies. And the second thing relates to the EU dimension, and it is that while EU defense cooperation will most likely decrease in importance for both Finland and Sweden somewhat, it will not completely lose its importance for these two countries. And that has to do with partly the fact that I think the content and qualitative content of EU defense cooperation has changed like quite a bit over the past years. And we're dealing more and more with the EU, through its defense policies, dealing a lot more with things that NATO doesn't deal with as much, or it doesn't have the same administrative capacities to deal with, such as military mobility, such as defense capability development and research cooperation. So these issues will continue to add value. And of course, I mean, we have to wait and see once NATO membership happens for both countries, of like how their approach to the EU-level defense cooperation initiatives like will develop. But I got the sense from both of you that perhaps they will look a little bit more like Germany rather than Poland or the Baltic countries, which Poland being usually the archetype of an Atlanticist EU country, and then Germany being somewhere between a Europeanist and an Atlanticist. But we have to, of course, wait and see. Thank you so much to all of you who came and join us today. I'd like to ask you to join me in giving an applause to the speakers. And please do follow all our other activities and join our mailing list, etc., and etc. And do join us for the other discussions as well in the future. Thanks. Thanks a lot, guys.